Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Luke Beckman looks at the condition of Nebraska's corn and soybeans. Kevin Bradley talks about Dicamba injury issues in Missouri. Kelly Smith explains how producers can help impact U.S. Drought Monitor changes. And Darrel Good discusses how closely USDA crop condition ratings project final yields. Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The USDA is scheduled to release its August crop report on Thursday at 11 a.m. Central. The numbers will contain the agency's estimates on yield and production derived from producer survey responses and actual field inspections. Farmers are undoubtedly hoping for something favorable in those numbers. Corn and soybean prices have slid over the last 3 weeks and were down noticeably Tuesday. We talked with Luke Wednesday afternoon at CVA's location south of Tilden, Nebraska, and began by asking about current crop conditions across CVA territory in the state.
Pretty variable. It's been a hit or miss kind of summer. It seems that way even across the entire belt. But here in Nebraska, pretty variable. You're south of the Platte River and things still look really good. Come north of the Platte River, it gets a lot more variable. Northeast part of the state, east of 81, probably the toughest spot. So variable. I think there's going to be some very good crops out there, and dryland certainly not what it was a year ago.
How does that compare to the rest of the Corn Belt?
Well, I think as you look even at the state of Iowa, you look at Illinois, very cut up with how the moisture has fallen. So I think the conditions in Nebraska are probably consistent with what we've seen in other states as well. So I think the trades has some question marks about production, and rightfully so.
The market was up a bit today, but the first 2 days of the week, not a great start. What's going on?
Well, I think you go back to Friday's Commitment of Traders report, and we still had some length left in corn and soybeans both. You come in Monday, you see the crop ratings in the afternoon. Corn was fine, it was supportive, but the soybean number up, a couple points. The market wasn't expecting that. So a lot of money started coming out of the beans, and it just pulled everything else with it.
Over the last 3 weeks, corn's lost about 40 cents, soybeans are down about 70. What things need to happen to try and eat away at some of that as we approach harvest?
Sure, I think that the August 10th crop report coming up next Thursday is obviously an important date. We've seen some private information from, Informa, FC Stone. Some of your private sector brokers have started to offer up, corn yield estimates that are in the low 160s. So I think that's supportive. I think when we get into next week, I think we'll be firm coming into the Thursday report. We'll see what those numbers have to say. But that could certainly be supportive. I think if you ran into any, early freeze type headlines or anything like that, that could certainly help. But you're going to have to get the money excited a little bit to really propel this thing. The issue is we can afford to have a smaller crop this year because our carryout from 16, 17 is going to be quite large for both corn and soybeans.
On the flip side, is there a chance we trend lower?
Certainly possible. I think 374 is the low on the December charts from a few weeks ago. If we break through that, certainly there's some more losses that could ensue. Soybeans probably are at a greater risk just because the weather forecast is pretty cool, wet for the soybean crop. There's a gap on the charts at 960. I think we go back and fill that eventually. So certainly some weakness that could happen before harvest.
What would be your thoughts on selling strategies for either old or new?
It gets a little bit tough. You look at the corn market and there's so much carry in that market from even the spot bid even to harvest. We have better prices at harvest available than we do currently. So I think that that's going to incent anybody with storage to hold it. I think that's going to happen. So you're going to see farmers, you're going to see elevators carry corn into the new crop marketing year. So I think it'll probably present some basis opportunities. We've seen that basis has firmed some in the last week to 10 days at your end user destinations. So everybody's going to want to be full coming out of harvest, both farmers and your commercial system.
You had mentioned that crop report on Thursday. It's a big one because of the yield number that will be released. What are your thoughts going into it?
I think the USDA is not going to come anywhere close to what the private estimates are. And remember, those folks are predicting what they think the final number is going to be, not what we're going to see next Thursday. So I think they'll take a couple bushels off. I think you'll see the corn yield in the 167, 168 range. Soybeans, they'll come off of that 50 number, maybe a shade, in the 48, 49. But overall, I think the market's going to anticipate a lot of that. So unless we see something else change in the balance sheet, acres could change for corn. That would certainly help. Otherwise, I think the market's kind of ready for this.
Right, you hinted at something important there. Do you sense the market is leaning one way or another going into this report?
I think that the market's probably trading a 165 type number today. I think the market's also going to expect the USDA to not just do it in one jump. If they make a cut in August, we'd probably expect them to make another cut in September. So it's going to be kind of that stair-step approach. It really is getting back into a range-bound type trade here in corn, and soybeans probably more at risk for some downside.
As we close out, I want to talk about the export market for corn and soybeans as it comes close to the end of their marketing years. Tell me what they've been like.
Soybean numbers are good. I think that number probably goes up in the August report. So far, the shipments have exceeded what the USDA is budgeting on their balance sheet. Corn's going to be pretty close. I think this marketing year is okay. As you get into next year, that's where the issues probably start to develop, just because Argentina and Brazil have had both good corn and soybean crops. So will be interesting to see if the USDA plays with demand for 17-18 in the August crop report.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to look at the USDA's August crop report. Dicamba injury issues that were apparent in certain regions of the country last year are becoming more pronounced in 2017. Products with dicamba could be especially useful to growers battling glyphosate-resistant weeds. Dicamba-tolerant soybeans and new approved formulations of dicamba just became available this year. But soybeans that aren't tolerant, along with several other broadleaf crops and plants, are especially sensitive to dicamba. Problems in 2016 resulted from off-label usage of older formulations, but newer versions are proving to be a challenge as well. Arkansas banned the use of dicamba in July, and Missouri briefly suspended its usage before reinstating it with added restrictions. This is unfamiliar territory in that there's no definite idea of potential yield hits due to damage. Further, crop insurance doesn't cover chemical injury, only losses from drought, flood, or other natural disasters. University of Missouri Extension weed scientist Kevin Bradley has continued to follow the issue in the South. He joined us recently to discuss injury in Missouri.
Well, we have over 300,000 acres is my estimate right now that are injured by dicamba, in my opinion. So it's a pretty significant issue for us.
For people that haven't seen it before, can you describe what the injury looks like?
Well, it's really kind of characteristic, and there are very few things that you can mistake it with, although there are some mimics, and I don't want to minimize that. But the number one thing that dicamba will do to soybeans is you'll see these trifoliates that'll be cupped upward, and it's pretty distinctive. If you see that, it's a fairly safe bet that you have dicamba injury given what's going on in this country right now. The leaves can also be strapped or pulled apart, abnormally compared to what they usually would be. But the cupping is pretty distinctive. This time of year in a lot of states, you can just be driving along the road at 60 miles an hour and see it from the truck. So it is something that shows up pretty easily.
In what conditions are most of these problems occurring?
Well, we've seen all conditions, all stages. There's definitely off-target movement due to just about every factor that's mentioned. But if we could nail down some of the conditions that are leading to this, then we'd really have some answers. And unfortunately, that's going to take some time, and I don't know how much progress we're going to be able to make on that, but that's something we're going to have to be looking at in the future. For example, you know, is it correlated with air temperature? Is it correlated with soil temperature or moisture of some kind or lack of moisture? All of those things are really on our minds right now and what we're looking into.
In a lot of these situations, was there a problem with wind speed, or do you think it was not necessarily drift but volatilization? Can you explain the difference between that?
Yeah, so I've come out pretty openly and said I believe that all of the above are occurring. I think there's definitely fields that have been drifted onto due to improper sprayer setup or just poor decisions at the time of spraying. But I also think there are numerous situations where people have done their very best and followed all the guidelines, and there was no wind, and yet we still have off-target movement of dicamba. And we've seen that for ourselves here over and over. And when you have entire fields that are injured away from the direction of the wind at spraying, first of all, that's a pretty good sign that something other than physical drift occurred. And so we, you know, really the rule rather than exception of the fields I've been in is that they're injured from one end to the other, and no discernible difference in injury symptomology. So, you know, a lot of those I think are movement through either inversions or volatility, and I think that is occurring for sure.
How volatile are these newer formulations?
Yeah, so that's the real question. I mean, that's going to be the question moving into 2018. There's a lot of really smart weed scientists all around the country trying to answer that question right now. But these formulations, they're marketed as less volatile, and I'm sure they are. Less volatile compared to some of the old standards like the Banville and all of that. But less volatile doesn't mean not volatile. And all signs, at least for 2017, in my opinion, appear to me that there is volatility in these new formulations. To what extent that is causing this problem is something we're going to have to be figuring out over the next couple of months.
Did I read correctly that your research indicates that some of these formulations can volatilize within 24 hours after application?
Yeah, so some of the kind of standard research that you would do in this whole arena is you make applications of these products, and then you go out to the field at different intervals after application, and you put indicator plants out there that have never been exposed to the herbicide as far as during the application. So we do that. A lot of other people do that. We've taken plants that were grown in the greenhouse and in the greenhouse when the application were made, and 24 hours put those soybean plants out in the field and monitored them for a period of time and seen cupping on them as much as 24 hours after the application was made. So that's a pretty good indication that there is volatility occurring. The other part of the picture that you really need to be able to say that with certainty is air sampling data, and we have some air sampling data that supports that same statement that there is volatility occurring. So again, it's all very preliminary right now. We need to figure out what amount is contributing to the problem, but yeah, it is concerning to say the least.
Obviously, one of the biggest questions is, do we know if there's a yield decrease to soybeans that are affected by this?
Yeah, that's the number one question for the grower, and unfortunately we can't really we can give you some estimates and we can give you some things to think about, but there's nobody that I know of that can just walk out into a field that's been injured with dicamba and say, okay, you're going to get a 2% yield loss. I mean, there's some people working on it. There's some people validating models to see if we can do that in the future. But, you know, all we can say at this point is if you have been drifted onto earlier in the season, the more likely your soybeans are to recover. If you have been drifted onto at flowering or beyond, the more likely you're going to have some kind of yield loss. And that's about really the only statements we can make. It's all about the severity of the drift after that.
My final question would be, do you think this is a product that can be safely applied?
I think it can, but I don't know that we've figured it out yet. And there's just too many unknowns. I don't know why the volatility aspect is so unpredictable, or maybe it's not. I don't know. We still have to learn that. But we have seen fields that you can go into and it looks like it has stayed where it was supposed to be sprayed. But again, I haven't seen a whole lot of those compared to the others. So why is it moving is the number one question that has to be answered if this technology and these herbicides are going to be a part of our future in agriculture.
Next week, Nebraska Extension Weed Management Specialist Amit Jalla will join us to discuss dicamba injury issues in Nebraska. The latest U.S. Drought Monitor shows only slight changes of moisture conditions in Nebraska over the last week. The monitor is a product of the National Drought Mitigation Center, located at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Released weekly, national, regional, and state-level maps indicate the severity of dry conditions and impact federal relief efforts due to those circumstances. While authors of the monitor use hard data to determine changes, they also factor in information from local areas. Kelly Smith from the National Drought Mitigation Center explains how farmers, ranchers, and others can submit photos to help the center get a better outlook of conditions.
Each week, Drought Monitor authors look at a lot of data to know where it has and hasn't rained, but the data doesn't tell the whole story. So the photos help us understand what people are actually experiencing and seeing on the ground. For example, some parts of the country, like the plains in the west, would typically look browner than the south and the east, where you expect it to look greener at more times of year. So the photos help us understand those differences better. They can submit photos to the Drought Impact Reporter. That's droughtreporter.unl.edu. There's a form on that website that allows them to upload photos. If that doesn't work very well for them, they can also send email to dirinfo@unl.edu. The very easiest option might be for people to tweet, though, using the hashtag Drought17. That's the word drought and the numbers 1 and 7. Ideally, we would like people to submit seasonally, once a season or even once a month, possibly weekly if conditions are really extreme. The advantage of submitting over time is that it gives us a basis for comparison. So when someone says it's really dry, it's really brown, we can compare that to what they think it should look like, and that makes a very strong case.
Kelly says it's helpful for authors to know who took a submitted photo as well as when and where the picture was taken. Conditions for U.S. corn and soybeans diverged this week. While corn lost a point in good to excellent categories, soybeans improved 2 points. The average ratings from the USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service are released weekly from May through harvest in the top 18 corn and soybean producing states. Economists Scott Irwin and Darrel Good from the University of Illinois have researched how those ratings could be used to potentially project final yields. Darrel joined us earlier this week to explain what the scoring indicates for yields in 2017, but we started by asking him to give more background about how the ratings are determined.
USDA has a number of crop observers in each state, and each observer is responsible for a particular geographic area. And so those observers make visual observations on a weekly basis in terms of the condition of the crop. The USDA provides them some guidelines in terms of what constitutes a very poor up to an excellent rating, and then each observer classifies a percentage of the crop in each of the categories from very poor up to excellent. Then USDA takes those observations and acreage weights them to give a state average condition rating and then a national average rating as well.
And the two categories that we're mostly focused on, Darrel, are the good and excellent, correct?
That's been our focus. I mean, since it's each category, there's 5 categories, and they have to add up to 100%, so that if you focus on the good and excellent, then kind of by default, you're also accounting for the poor and very poor as the residual that's not good and excellent. But our work is focused on just what percentage of the crop is rated good or excellent. and how that changes through the season.
So how valuable can these ratings be during the season?
Well, it varies a bit between corn and soybeans. We do know that the initial ratings for both crops are generally a bit on the high side. That is, crops generally always look good early in the season before weather has had a chance to take its toll on the crop. And then on average, ratings decline as you go to the final report of the year. So if you recognize that bias, if you will, and correct the weekly observations for that bias, I think the in-season ratings can be very useful because there is a high correlation between final ratings and yield. So if you can correct in-season ratings for that bias, I think they become a very useful tool.
Is there a certain point in the season where the projection tightens up, that margin of error slims in corn and soybeans?
Yes, there's a very definite point. It's earlier for corn than soybeans, but typically by mid-July, the ratings on corn are pretty close to final ratings. Again, on average, we know that there's a lot of variation from year to year. And not surprisingly, that point is later in the season for soybeans. It's really into early August before that bias really points towards zero and the ratings really get close to the final rating.
Based on your calculations, Darrel, at this point in the season, with the crop condition ratings, where would you project final yields?
If we relied entirely on the crop conditions model, today's ratings would point to a U.S. average yield of 167.2 bushels and soybeans at 47.7. Again, I'm not sure I would ever rely 100% on crop conditions as a forming yield expectations, but as one component, I think it does give you a good barometer of where we are.
Do you see ways that these ratings or how we use these ratings can be improved?
I'm sure there are, and there are people that are tinkering with models that based on different weights of the different rating categories and also adjusting those for maturity of the crop. We do know that, as I mentioned, by mid-July, the ratings on corn get awfully close to the final ratings, but we also recognize that maturity of the crop varies a lot in mid-July from year to year. So I think those ratings could be adjusted for maturity of the crop that might be able to get us a little closer on useful observations during the season. And there are folks that are tinkering with that and using that in forming their own expectations.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Quite a cool down as we move toward the end of this week. Of course, we had the very warm temperatures in the first part of the week. Then we had the cold front move through. So much of the forecast from last week kind of verified. The only exception was the precipitation event as the cold front come through was much less than what the models were indicating. And so we had more scattered convection. Now, in terms of the drought monitor, we're not showing the drought monitor this week. We did have some slight improvements for that area right around Columbus that received the heavier precipitation. And we've had a few other pockets across the state that have received what would be considered enough moisture to see some slight reductions in the drought monitor. But our consensus was we would like to see what the impacts of this weekend's rains into early next week with the precipitation added on to what we've seen the last 10 days to get us a much clearer picture of what has really occurred across the state in terms of the drought. So expect to see some improvements in the drought monitor, but we're going to need to see some significant rainfall throughout the month of August to make us feel comfortable to see wholesale changes in the current drought monitor depiction. So as we go to the upper air models, what we are going to notice is we have a broad trough that's carved through. Of course, that's that cool air that's coming in. And so we have this conflict between the very warm conditions of the southwest and the cool air to the northeast. And if we have a surface low also indicated in the Texas Panhandle, which is going to lift Gulf moisture up over this cool air, causing an overrunning event. Starts out in western Nebraska today and then starts to move eastward. So that trough starts to pivot back a little bit, gives a little bit of energy over eastern Nebraska. And with this low slowly moving into central Texas, really going to move the moisture up into our region tomorrow. and it looks like a fairly widespread precipitation event with the heaviest of it in eastern Oklahoma, but this does look like a good overrunning event. Then this trough starts to slip a little bit toward the east, still keeps our cool temperatures in place as we have high pressure basically from the northern plains to the southwestern high plains, and that wraparound moisture will bring the moisture up into the southern Rockies, keeping most of the area dry, precipitation to our east. Now as we get into Tuesday, that trough still remains in place, starts to weaken a little bit, but we still have firm high pressure in place. So that's going to keep all of the precipitation for the most part to the south of us and to the west of us. And you can see that frontal boundary laying out across the southeastern United States and some scattered convection over the intermountain regions. Then the trough starts to lift a little bit toward the northeast, and we start to see some warmer air trying to build into our region, but high pressure will remain firmly in control at least through Wednesday, blocking the movement of moisture into our region. Some upslope flow may occur in the panhandle, but not a widespread event. Now as we get into Thursday, we start to see a little buckle in the jet stream with the northwest flow, so there may be some mid-layer energy moving through our region, but high pressure firmly in control of the northern plains. But we do once again have a surface low over Texas. That's going to pump moisture up into the western part of the state, giving us a decent shot of moisture on Thursday. And then on Friday, the trough starts to deepen a little bit again, with that moisture moving up from the north and high pressure over the northern plains. Perfect classic scenario for an overrunning situation. And the models are fairly aggressive with the precipitation indicated for Nebraska. Now as we take this out a little bit farther, from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, that cool high pressure is going to remain in place over the central United States, so well below normal temperatures. And in terms of precipitation, with that overrunning event scheduled for next Friday, next Saturday, we are looking at a broad area of above normal moisture. If we take this out a little bit farther, the latest 30-day forecast does show most of the central United States with below normal tendencies. That's a change from the month before we were above normal, and that means that our 90-day forecast we were showing for above normal temperatures for our region is likely to come in closer to normal.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, Dicamba injury, and USDA crop condition ratings. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Jeff Peterson will be our market analyst, and Dave Aiken will discuss property tax reform efforts in Nebraska. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.